Good afternoon, and welcome to the LungLife AI investor presentation. Throughout this recorded presentation, investors will be in listen-only mode. Questions are encouraged and can be submitted at any time by the Q&A tab situated in the right-hand corner of your screen. Just simply type in your questions and press send. The company may not be in a position to answer every question it receives during the meeting itself. However, the company will review all questions submitted today and publish responses where it is appropriate to do so. Before we begin, I'd like to submit the following poll. I'd now like to hand you over to Paul Pagano, CEO. Good afternoon to you, sir.
Welcome, and thank you all for joining us today. As mentioned, I'm Paul Pagano. I'm the CEO of the company. I'm joined by David Anderson, our Chief Financial Officer. LungLife is a diagnostic company, and we're focused on the early detection of lung cancer, all from a simple blood draw. There we go. For those of you who've been following the story, you won't be surprised that we remain very focused on getting the results from our pivotal validation study of our LUNG-LB test. In this update today, we're going to cover not only the progress since the beginning of the year, but we'll also share that in anticipation of receiving positive study results, what we've accomplished in laying the foundation for commercial readiness. Just by way of reminder, lung cancer is the #1 cancer killer. We're focused on one aspect of that. That's the indeterminate lung nodule. These are abnormal growths that are found in the lung by CT scan, and the tools that are currently available to doctors to evaluate them are inadequate. They lead to long delays in treatment, significant harms, and costs to the patients. And we'll go into more detail on that later on. But what we expect to show in our pivotal validation study is that LUNG-LB will be a useful tool in stratifying which of these two paths the patient should take, reducing delays in treatment and at the same time healthcare costs. As for the updates, we're very pleased to report that we continue to execute on our key milestones that we laid out on our AIM listing just 2 short years ago, with the overall goal of launching our LUNG-LB test commercially. The updates themselves are broken into 4 buckets. First, on the validation study, during the last update, we reported that we had 13 hospitals that were recruiting patients. Since then, we had completed enrollment of all 425 study participants. That was reported in May. In the end, we had 17 total sites that had been activated. And at this point in time, we've initiated the final data collection and verification process. This is where we go through and make sure that the data are accurate and complete ahead of the results analysis. And at this point in time, we continue to estimate the readout of that validation study will be available in September. On the regulatory side of things, in the last update, we had reported that we initiated our FDA de novo application. By way of a reminder, FDA is voluntary. We've decided to go down the FDA path because we feel it will provide confidence to all stakeholders, but we could commercialize with our CLIA license alone, and we'll discuss that later on. We are continuing that de novo application with the idea that once the results are available, we'll drop that in and then submit it off to the FDA. We have also just recently successfully completed a biannual CAP renewal audit. CAP is an independent body that monitors laboratories. And so David and I anticipate that CAP renewal should be coming out shortly. As for reimbursement, this is how you get paid for your test in the United States. During the last update, we had discussed that we have 2 of the 3 parts of reimbursement complete. That's our code, which was granted in January of 2022, as well as our price. We were assigned a national Medicare price of $2,030 per test, and that was by way of a final pricing determination of crosswalk. That was roughly a year ahead of schedule of what we had originally planned for. And then since then, we've been focused on the next phase in the commercialization process, which is the early access program. This is where we've identified early adopter physicians that are interested in ordering tests, and it's where we will gain that initial knowledge of how the test is used in the clinic and whether or not it's useful. That's important information for continuing the third part of the reimbursement stool, which is coverage. That's where payers such as the public payers like Medicare and Medicaid, as well as private payers, will decide to pay or reimburse you for the tests that were performed. As part of that early adopter program, we've been enrolling in key state Medicaid programs where those early adopters are located. and we'll continue that over the course of the next few years. And then we've also, in anticipation of those positive study results, onboarded a market access professional. This is an individual who has a deep set of experiences in winning contracts with payers. So they'll continue to help refine our reimbursement strategy, as well as help with what's called the credentialing process. That's where you work with the payers to garner those coverage decisions. And then just some last points to touch on. During the last update, we had discussed that we had submitted 2 manuscripts for peer review, and we're very pleased to announce that both of those were accepted in medical journals. First, with our health economics manuscript, this showed that the LUNG-LB test was cost effective when added to the standard of care for nodule evaluation. And then the second one was our pilot study. That was 151 study participants, and really laid the foundation for our larger pivotal validation study. So both of those studies are a good signal to the market that raise awareness about the company, what we're trying to do with the technology. We also discussed the EDRN partnership. This is the Early Detection Research Network, and I'll discuss that in more detail later, but we have commenced enrollment for that second study. That'll be a total of around 600 study participants over the course of 5 years with our partners at UCLA and Boston University. And then the last thing I'll touch on in alignment with raising awareness about the company, we were invited to be a guest speaker at a global lung cancer summit just 2 months ago, and we're very delighted to say that the LUNG-LB test was received very well, and many of the physicians are looking forward to our study results that'll come out in September. As for timelines, we've highlighted in on 2023 as it's a very pivotal year for us. We wrapped up enrollment of our validation study in May of this year. Again, we continue to expect results to come out in September. Ever since the beginning, we've really been focused on getting that FDA application ready. The idea being once the results are in, we can drop that into the application and then submit that off to the FDA. Now, I don't have a dot on here for when we expect FDA approval. Typically, we've been seeing between a year and a year and a half after submission. That's just the way the timelines are working out this period. But again, as a reminder, FDA is voluntary. The idea here is that we'll commercialize the test using our CLIA license, and that's basically going to allow us to start this early access program in our clinical utility studies. This is where we will start getting that initial evidence on whether or not the test is useful and how doctors are using it in practice. And that will allow us to have early engagement with our local Medicare contractor and other payers to start this local coverage determination process. And because we do believe that we will be able to bill for this test by the end of this year, it's where we expect our first nominal revenues. And with that, I'll hand it over to David for the finances.
Thank you, Paul. Good afternoon, everybody. So we ended the period with cash of just over 5.3 million, having started the year with about 8 million. The vast majority of that spend was on operating activities. We spent just 2.7 million on operating activities as a comparison to last year, 3.3 million. So that cash that we have together with our runway and expected spend takes us through to mid-2024. Just wanted to point out that based on the equipment that we have currently in our CLIA lab, which is 3 microscopes, and the staff that we've got, we currently have the capacity to run 5,000 tests a year, which at our CMS price of just over $2,000 is clearly just over 10 million revenue. So we can do that currently without any additional capex and any additional staff costs, and our ability to increase that number is really through adding extra microscopes, which add about 2,000 tests a year without going into automation. And then just looking then at our primary statements, cash flow statement I've just discussed, income statement, small amount of revenue, that is the royalty income that we get from our joint venture partner in China. That's 6% of their revenues in the period, so their gross revenues in that 6-month period, just over 380,000. Admin expenses, the 2 largest items continue to be staff costs and R&D spend. Staff costs in the period just over 1.3 million, and R&D spend in the period just over 800,000. And then moving through to the balance sheet, the intangible asset is the license that we agreed with Mount Sinai. The only other point I'd note on the balance sheet is our lease liabilities. We have two lease liabilities, one being the finance lease, if you will, on a couple of microscopes, which is about 334 at the end of the period. And the other lease is the lease on our property, given how you have to account for these days, which is about 340,000. Thank you. Back to you, Paul. Oh, just as you take some water.
That's right. Thanks, David. So back to lung cancer, it is a big problem. It's the #1 cancer killer. Just in the United States alone, 350 people die every single day from the disease. That's more than breast, prostate, and colorectal cancers combined. And the reason is that 80% of all lung cancers are diagnosed when it's too late. However, it is curable if you detect it early. There is a CT screening program for early lung cancer detection. However, uptake of screening is low because of all the uncertainty that's created. This is the indeterminate lung nodule. I'll touch on this in a moment exactly what those are, but there's so much hesitancy is that the majority of early lung cancer that is detected today isn't through a screening program. It's actually by chance when an individual gets a CT scan for a completely different reason. So as I mentioned, early detection is centered around the CT scan in that indeterminate lung nodule. This is an abnormal growth in the lung, and the reason it's called indeterminate is because doctors aren't sure what it is at the time of discovery. It could be an infection, it could be scar tissue, or it could be lung cancer. And the tools at the physician's disposal are inadequate. There's watchful waiting. This is where the patient will come back in 3, 6, 12 months' time, get another CT scan, see if that nodule has grown in size. As you can imagine, this leads to a lot of patient anxiety, wondering if there's a tumor growing inside them. And then that delay in treatment also reduces their potential to have a cure. The other option is to get a biopsy, and this involves sticking a long needle across the chest wall to get a little piece of that nodule and look at it under the microscope. As you can imagine, this results oftentimes in serious harms. 1 in 5 patients will experience an adverse event. This is something like a collapsed lung or internal bleeding. There have even been individuals who have died as a result of having a lung biopsy. And then when you learn that 40% of all lung biopsies return a no lung cancer diagnosis, it means we're putting a lot of patients in harm's way for no good reason. And in addition to those escalating harms, there are increasing costs as you progress through this pathway. So CT scan starts at around $200 per test. Once you go off to biopsy, it jumps to around $15,000. And then should that biopsy result in an adverse event that requires hospitalization, the costs then soar to around $40,000. So what you end up with here is a standard of care that really provides more harms and costs than it does answers. And this is where we believe the LUNG-LB technology can help. So we believe that it will be helpful. Not only is it a high-performing, well-balanced test, but it's also very simple to use. It's all based on a simple blood draw, which is part of standard of care because doctors already need to order a blood test when they're considering a biopsy. And what we look for in that test are circulating tumor cells. These are bits of the tumor that enter the bloodstream and try and spread to different parts of the body. The way we detect them is critical. It's a process called FISH. This is where we apply light signals to the DNA, and we can pick those up on the microscope. The microscope then uses our artificial intelligence algorithm to show the technician the CTCs, and then if they're present, the test goes off as positive. If they're not present, the test goes off as negative. Again, keeping it very simple for the physician to understand. Now, we had previously completed a pilot study where we enrolled 151 study participants with indeterminate lung nodules. And what we did was we compared the results of the biopsy to the result of our blood test. And what we saw were well-balanced or roughly equal sensitivity and specificity. And this is important because a physician is going to need to understand whether or not this is cancer or a non-cancerous nodule. We're very pleased to report that these results were accepted in a peer-reviewed publication in a respected medical journal in June of this year. Now, based on the strong performance in that pilot study, we initiated our pivotal validation study of LUNG-LB. This is where we enrolled 425 study participants across 17 sites in the United States. We completed enrollment in May of 2023. And again, right now we're making sure that all of the data that we're collecting is accurate and complete ahead of the analysis, and we expect the results to be available in September. Now, the second study that we'd like to tell you about today is with the Early Detection Research Network of the National Cancer Institute. This was by way of invitation from UCLA and Boston University, two leading institutions here in the US with significant experience in indeterminate lung nodules. They saw how LUNG-LB can be uniquely combined with additional biomarkers, particularly those that are found on the CT scan, to enhance nodule management. And there are a few key benefits that we'd like to share with you by participating in this EDRN program. First, this will be the first independent validation of LUNG-LB. And while our pivotal validation study is critically important, doctors tend to hold independent validations in much higher esteem. This also increases exposure of the company and awareness about our technology to a network of 300 of the most well-known top physicians in the United States who are solely focused on the early detection of cancer. And lastly, it provides an ability for us to expand our product offering because new biomarkers that are identified at both UCLA and Boston University can be translated into our CLIA lab and offered to patients in the commercial setting. So we're very delighted and honored to be a part of the EDRN study. Now, on the pivotal study, right now the data are blinded to us, and they're going to be processed by a third party. That keeps the integrity of the study very high. And there are a few metrics that David and I would like to share with you today that give us confidence that we enrolled the right patients and that we're running a very rigorous study. First is that the average nodule size is 14 millimeters. That's on the smaller end. These represent the ones that doctors oftentimes have the most trouble evaluating, and they could represent the earlier stage cancers. This is where most other technologies tend to have trouble, but what we showed in our pilot publication is that we actually excel when the nodules are smaller. About half of our study sites are Veterans Affairs hospitals, and if you recall from prior presentations, veterans are thought to be at higher risk for lung cancer because of what they're exposed to during military service. And while getting things started in the VA can take time, we felt it was an important thing to do, and it's already been a very rewarding process. Now, lung cancer is often thought of as a disease that's caused by smoking. However, for some time, we've noticed an increase in the frequency of lung cancer in never smokers, which now represents between 20 and 25% of all new lung cancer cases. In our pilot study, we didn't see a difference in test performance between patients who have smoked versus those who have never smoked. So we didn't make it an enrollment criteria for our study. And so we have about 24% participation from never smokers. And lastly, we estimate that around 25% of our study participants came from minority groups. That's important because most studies that are done today are far less than 10%. And the whole point of doing these studies is to give physicians confidence in the data. And when the study population looks like the patients that they serve, we believe this will help us when it comes time to deploy the test because doctors are going to feel more assured when they go to order it. Now, as lung cancer is the #1 killer, you can imagine there is a significant opportunity to make an impact in early detection using our LUNG-LB test. While the market opportunity is large here in the United States, we've identified a niche entry point that's with the indeterminate lung nodules. Again, there are around 1.5 million of those found every single year in the United States. And we estimate that represents between a $3 and $6 billion opportunity. The idea here is to prove the technology with nodules first, and then we can potentially expand to other parts of early detection. Now, we believe that doctors will initially use the technology for what's called an intermediate risk nodules. These are the most challenging to evaluate, and pulmonologists know that. It's where we saw high performance in our pilot study. And then eventually, we believe that as time goes on, physicians will naturally apply the LUNG-LB test to all nodule risk levels. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, we believe there's room to grow within early detection. Right now, LUNG-LB is placed after the CT scan, so once a nodule is discovered. But we have physicians that are already asking us if this can be coupled with the CT scan, or in some instances, if it can be moved ahead of the CT scan, particularly in rural areas of the United States where patients might have to drive 2 to 3 hours in order to get a CT scan, because their thought is that a blood test would be much easier to deploy in those situations. So plenty of room to grow in the early lung cancer space. So onto the commercialization side. As I mentioned before, we're not waiting around for study results to come in. Since day one, we've been running parallel processes that have really served to build the foundation for commercialization. And this foundation started with our CLIA license. That's the first step in the regulatory and reimbursement pathway. That continued with our CAP accreditation, which again, we anticipate will be renewed following a very successful audit just earlier this month, and our New York State CLEP permit. So all three of those give us access to 47 states. So we have authorization to essentially offer this test commercially to over 90% of the US population. Now, FDA is something that the company is also focused on. We've run our study to FDA standards, but again, it's optional because we could commercialize with CLIA and our New York State permit. But the reason that we spent the extra time and effort running an FDA study is because we feel it will provide confidence to doctors, patients, as well as the payers. Now, we're going to be approaching the FDA with what are called adjunct claims. So this means that the LUNG-LB test is going to be another tool in the physician's toolkit. The FDA really likes adjunct claims because it puts the onus on the doctor and the responsibility on the doctor's end. Now, the last step with commercialization is reimbursement. And just as a reminder, there are three parts to that. We've laid the groundwork with our PLA code and national pricing, which we had announced was $2,030 per test. That was assigned in November of last year. The next piece of reimbursement is coverage. And this is where showing clinical utility is going to be crucial. And this is why we plan to start gathering that initial utility evidence early in our early access program as soon as the validation study results are in. We have the design of the early access program already in place. We've already identified early adopter sites to help us with this. And the reason that we're working early is because typically that Medicare coverage determination process can take upwards of 18 months. Now, the good news is that a positive coverage determination from Medicare will result in back payments of reimbursement claims over the course of the coverage review period. So the idea is to continue offering the test commercially, show that utilization is increasing, and there will be a light at the end of the reimbursement tunnel. That's, again, very typical of new advanced diagnostic tests. One just needs to be persistent. So while we need to have the results of the validation study in hand prior to making the test available to patients, there are things, again, that we're doing now to make sure that we're ready. And I'll just share a few of those on this slide that we haven't yet covered. Expanding on what was previously said with reimbursement, in the early days, payment collected on tests performed is expected to be low in the absence of payer coverage decisions. The insurance company will deny our claims, meaning that they're not going to pay for it because they feel that the test wasn't necessary. And that's why David and I have partnered with what's called a revenue cycle management company. This group has significant experience in appealing those denials from payers. And through that partnership, our plan is to work with the payers to overturn every single denial with the expectation that as test utilization increases and positive coverage determinations are made, there will be fewer denials to contest. In anticipation of those positive study results, again, we've also engaged a market access professional to further refine not only our reimbursement strategy, but also to spearhead securing coverage from both public and private payers. And again, we've already started making progress in this area as we are now a Medicare provider in many of the key states where our early adopters are located. Crucial to winning those coverage decisions is generating and providing sufficient evidence to the payers. And that's where our pilot study and health economic studies are great first steps. This work is going to continue with our early access program, which again is now fully designed. And we have interested physicians who are keen on ordering the test and providing us results on test utility. We expect, again, that early access program to provide the initial evidence for test utility that can be used to engage with the payers. And then last but not least, we will work to raise awareness of the company and our technology by continuing to present at academic conferences and working very closely with our key opinion leaders to further disseminate information about LUNG-LB to the medical community. Again, this is another reason why the EDRN relationship is such a powerful one. So LungLife's vision is to flip the 80-20 ratio. This means that right now, 80% of lung cancers are diagnosed too late. We'd rather have 80% of lung cancers diagnosed early when you can effectuate a cure. And the way that we do that is by continuing to hit our milestones. For the remainder of 2023, investors should look forward to the results of our pivotal validation study. Again, that's coming out in September, which, if successful, will support the de novo submission to the FDA. Again, it's a voluntary process. Our plan is to commercialize with the CLIA license once the results are in. We'll continue to expand access to the LUNG-LB test by applying for individual state Medicaid programs and by working with Medicare and private payers, all while continuing to build evidence for the LUNG-LB test in our early access program and clinical utility studies. And again, because we expect to bill towards the end of this year, we expect initial, albeit nominal, revenues for the LUNG-LB test as well. So that concludes our update. I would like to thank you all for your time and attention, and we're happy to take any questions.
Paul, David, thank you very much for your presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, please do continue to submit your questions just by using the Q&A tab, which is situated in the top right corner of your screen. But just while the company take a few moments to review those questions submitted today, I'd like to remind you that a recording of this presentation, along with a copy of the slides and the published Q&A, can be accessed via your investor dashboard. As you can see, we've received a number of questions throughout today's presentation. And if I may at this point, just hand back to you just to read through those questions and give response to it as appropriate to do so, and then I'll pick up from you at the end.
That sounds great. Thank you. So the first question that's in is, at peak sales, how many tests per annum do you think will be used in the United States? How long do you envisage, excuse me, not a word we typically use in the States, will it take to get to peak sales? So I won't speculate at this time about peak sales, but what I will reiterate is what David had mentioned in terms of our current capacity, what we believe that we can get to, and how that relates to our break-even point. So right now we have the ability to process around 5,000 tests per year with our existing microscopes as well as our personnel. That at a current Medicare price of $2,000 roughly per test gets us to around $10 million of revenue. That's actually roughly our break-even point. And as David mentioned, for every microscope we add, we can add an additional 2,000 tests per year. So the idea is add more microscopes as demand calls for it, and then you can build your capacity that way. Now, right now, currently, the tests are being run in a manual process, but because FISH is such a tried and true technology, there are instruments out there to automate the FISH process. And so with that automation, we can also reduce our labor costs and increase throughput as well. There are also robots that bolt onto the microscope. So for example, our microscopes can do 8 at a time, but there's a microscope that can, that can load 100 slides at a time. So there are not only personnel changes that we can adapt to, but also automation equipment that can increase our throughput. And then another option, if we wanted to expand beyond the service model, where patients will send us blood and we process it and give the doctors the result, there is also the potential to deploy this to academic centers to run in their CLIA facilities. So right now we use a microscope that is approved by the FDA for other indications. And what that means is that this microscope is oftentimes placed at other hospital systems. And so you can imagine we could sell our software system to go onto that microscope so they can use the LUNG-LB test. And then we could have a reagent sales model where we sell them the reagents necessary to isolate the CTCs and run the tests at their own. So there are multiple ways that David and I have been thinking about in terms of scaling the business. David, I'm not sure if you had anything to add to that. Good.
Nope.
All right. Next question is, can you provide information about the intellectual property / patents that are hopefully in place to protect our position? Yeah, this is an excellent question. So being a high-tech company, we're always focused on developing novel ways to do things and having those keen observations to see what could protect us, either in terms of keeping it proprietary or patenting it. We have licensed IP from MD Anderson Cancer Center on the use of the probes and the technology, but then we also have a series of internal patents that also help to ring fence what we're doing. The first one which was applied for in 2019 that has moved on to PCT or international phase, protects our development of the AI algorithm. We've also filed at this point 4 additional patent applications, one actually that was just 6 weeks ago, that cover not only the isolation process, but the way we interpret the cells and then how we report the results to physicians. So we have ring-fenced not only the artificial intelligence process, but everything from CTC isolation all the way to results reporting. And then, of course, outside of the patents, there are items that we decide not to patent that we believe would be challenging to replicate. That's the proprietary know-how in the lab that stays within our 4 walls. And then we have agreements with all of our employees not to disclose that outside the business. Okay, the next question that we have is, what impact does not having FDA approval for a year or so have on potential sales and pricing? It's hard to nail exactly what that impact would be. Of course, doctors and patients would love for the test to be FDA approved. What they will also love to hear is that the test was run to FDA standards, that the study was run to FDA standards. And that will be apparent in our protocol and in our peer-reviewed publication, which we can share with physicians. Again, it's going to be a year and a half before FDA approval is there, but physicians are well aware that FDA approval is not required for diagnostic tests. In fact, something around 80% of all diagnostics that are run here in the United States do not have FDA approval. So while it is a good seal of approval, it's not something that's necessarily a requirement, also on the physician side. So hopefully that answers that question. And then the last question is, actually, this is very similar to what we covered. What would you have to do to scale? Again, we can purchase additional microscopes that adds around 2,000 tests per year. There's automation equipment that will further scale upon that. And then there's also the distributed model where we can have academic hospitals that already have the equipment, train them on our test, and then that way they can run the test at their facility, and then LungLife can also continue to provide a service model, especially in community hospitals where they typically don't have their own CLIA labs that can run these advanced tests. Okay, last question that just came in. R&D, can you talk around what's needed, required here? Yeah, that's an excellent question. So our plan is to always continue to develop this technology, so we don't want to stand still. We believe that it is deserving of the patients to offer them not only the highest quality test, but the best performing test. And so I mentioned that patent that we applied for just 6 weeks ago. We believe that the information contained in that patent is going to help inform a future generation of the LungLB technology. And so we're looking at ways of not only enhancing test performance, that could be with either continuous learning with the artificial intelligence algorithm going on in the background, new isolation techniques, but the idea would be to further refine that LungLB technology and then go back to the agency with what's called the 510K application. And that's where you can provide either a software update or a technology update. They review the updated information, and then you can proceed with offering that technology to patients and physicians. So our plan is to always continue developing the test and not standing still. That way we stay ahead of the curve and the competition and offer what's best to our patients.
Perfect. Paul, David, thank you very much for that. I think you've addressed all those questions from investors. And of course, the company will review all the questions submitted today and will publish those responses on the Investor Meet Company platform. But just before redirecting investors to provide you with their feedback, which is particularly important to you both, Paul, could I just ask you for a few closing comments?
Yes, I'll just say that, we're immensely excited about the progress that we've made, and we're very proud of the team for hitting all of our milestones since our AIM listing just a couple of short years ago. We've been working on this test for quite some time, and it's really exciting to be driving the transition from what is a purely development company to a clinical commercial stage company. That means that all of our hard work is soon going to be manifested as a benefit to these patients that we aim to serve.
Perfect. Paul, David, thank you once again for updating investors today. Could I please ask investors not to close the session, as you'll now be automatically redirected to provide your feedback in order that the management team can better understand your views and expectations. This will only take a few moments to complete, but some shall be greatly valued by the company. On behalf of the management team of Long Life AI, we'd like to thank you for attending today's presentation, and good afternoon to you all.
Thank you.
you.